Olá, boa tarde. Estamos a mais um programa Poesia ao Meio Dia, promovido pela Cátedra William Butler Yeats, da Faculdade de Filosofia, Letras e Ciências Humanas da Universidade de São Paulo. E hoje temos a honra da nossa convidada, professora Irene De Angelis, que é professora associada de literatura inglesa da Universidade de Turim, na Itália, e ela faz parte. Bom dia, ela faz parte do conselho da EFACES, ela é diretora do Centro Interdepartamental de Estudos Irlandeses, e as suas publicações incluem um estudo italiano sobre uma perspectiva internacional da poesia de Derek Meehan, em 2010, sobre as peças do No, de William Butler Yeats, e o que eu chamo de o incrível livro The Japanese Effect in Irish Poetry, in Contemporary Irish Poetry, de 2012, com o poeta Joseph Woods, que também leremos hoje aqui nesse programa. A professora Irene coeditou o também maravilhoso Our Shared Japan, an Anthology of Contemporary Irish Poetry, de 2007. Ela também publicou ensaios e capítulos de livros sobre os mais variados autores de Derek Meehan, Seamus Heaney, Michael Longley, Beckett, Marina Carr, Rudyard Kipling, so many others, né, e tantos outros. Em 2019, ela publicou a tradução italiana do livro The Rain Bridge, de Derek Meehan, com os desenhos de Sarah Irlander. Os seus interesses de pesquisa incluem estudos Oriente e Ocidente, ecocrítica e a representação do etarismo na literatura e nas artes. Hoje, a nossa convidada vai nos trazer alguns poemas de autores irlandeses que se referem ao Japão. Então, vamos ter aqui bastante transculturalidade. E muito obrigada, professora Irene, e a palavra é sua. The floor is yours. The video is yours.
First of all, thanks a lot, Giselle, for this invitation. I'm delighted to be able to join you today from Italy, from Turin. We will begin our conversation today by, as you already said, taking a look at some Irish poems dealing with the Japanese effect, so to say. And the first one I would like to introduce is by W.B. Yeats, and it is entitled Imitated from the Japanese. A most astonishing thing. 70 years have I lived. Hurrah for the flowers of spring, for spring is here again. 70 years have I lived, no rugged beggar man. 70 years have I lived. 70 years man and boy, and never have I danced for joy. I can't hear you, Giselle.
Thank you. Feitos japoneses, algo de muito surpreendente. Vivi 70 anos. Viva as flores da primavera, porque a primavera veio de novo. Vivi 70 anos, sem me tornar um mendigo esfarrapado. 70 anos vivi, 70 anos, homem e menino, e jamais dancei de alegria.
All right, so it was late in his life that W.B. Yeats became interested in Zen Buddhism. Mainly, it is said by reading the writings of D.T. Suzuki. And also his late poems seem to draw energy from the No Theatre of Japan, as it is evident from his late drama, starting from At the Hawk's Well, which was published in 1916. His understanding of the No Theatre, however, was mediated by the role played by Ezra Pound. And the reason why he became fascinated with the Orient is because he was searching for a symbolic and aristocratic form of art. W.B. Yeats perceived that there was a connection between this symbolic form and the legends of the Irish countryside, especially about spirits. And as you've listened, the poem we just read is a celebration of the speaker's long life, and this is the main issue that it is concerned with.
Thank you, Irene. Can we move on to the Snow Party?
Sure. So the second poem that Giselle and I have selected together is entitled The Snow Party, and it was published in 1975 by Derek Meehan. Basho, coming to the city of Nagoya, is asked to a snow party. There is a tinkling of china and tea into china. There are introductions. Then everyone crowds to the window to watch the falling snow. Snow is falling on Nagoya and farther south on the tiles of Kyoto. Eastward, beyond Irago, it is falling like leaves on the cold sea. Elsewhere, there are burning witches and heretics in the boiling squares. Thousands have died since dawn in the service of barbarous kings. But there is silence in the houses of Nagoya and the hills of Ise.
A Festa da Neve, Derek Meehan. Ao chegar em Nagoya, Basho é convidado a uma festa da neve. Há um tinido de xícaras e chá vertido nas xícaras, há apresentações e então todos se juntam diante da janela para ver a neve que cai. A neve cai em Nagoya. E mais para o sul, sobre os telhados de Kyoto, a leste, além de Irago, ela cai como folhas sobre o mar gelado. Longe queimam bruxas e hereges em praças incandescentes. Milhares morrem desde a aurora, a serviço de reis bárbaros. Mas há silêncio nas casas de Nagoya e nas colinas de Ise.
Right. So now we move on to another poem by Derek Meehan, as we've just said, a writer from Northern Ireland, from the city of Belfast, who was deeply influenced by W.B. Yeats, among others, Dylan Thomas, World War I poets, T.S. Eliot, Louis MacNeice, and also by the existentialists, Sartre, Camus, and Pascal as well. What is a poem about? It is a poem about a series of elsewheres, we might say. And one may wonder who Basho is. Basho, the protagonist of this poem, was a 17th century poet and traveler whose masterpiece was titled The Narrow Road to the Deep North and Other Travel Sketches, published in English by Penguin in 1966. Basho was best known as a haiku master. So then we may come to explain what a haiku is, although some of our listeners may already be familiar with this particular genre of poetry. A haiku is a poem with a 5-7-5 syllable structure, usually inspired by Zen poetry, and including a seasonal reference, the so-called Kigo word. One among Basho's haiku poems is about a snow viewing party that he probably witnessed, he was invited to. And Mehan may have drawn inspiration from it, although his poem reaches well beyond the world of the Japanese tea ceremony. Now, if we think about 17th century Ireland, we may remember that the country was torn by the Williamite Wars. And if we think about the rest of the world, in 1692, in New England, there were the so-called Salem witch trials. So among the many elsewheres that this poem seems to allude to, there are also these references. And all these allusions allowed Mehan to take the distance from the troubles, which importantly enough were escalating in Ulster in the 1970s. And from a letter he sent to his friend, who is the dedicatee of this poem, Louis Azakoff, we know that Mehan also thought about the Vietnam War, which was happening at the time. So interestingly, in this elsewhere, we have an allusion to the outer world, and we have an evidence of how Derek Mann was concerned with war throughout the world. Okay.
Thank you. Should I read the next one in Portuguese first, and then you go to the original? Does that make more sense? Okay, the weather in Japan. O clima no Japão. O clima no Japão faz da chuva cortinas de contas e da névoa uma tela de papel. Yeah, I think in the sequence I will read the next one because they're very brief.
Sure,
okay.
Thanks.
A Natural History of Armed Conflict, 2007. A História Natural do Conflito Armado, 2007. A madeira do teixo fez a cuia e a flecha e a sombra lateral da cova. Obrigada.
Obrigada, Giselle. So I read the first one in English, The Weather in Japan. Makes bead curtains of the rain, of the mist, a paper screen. So this very short, very iconic poem by Michael Longley was part of the collection by the same title, The Weather in Japan, published in 2000. Michael Longley, for this collection, was awarded the T.S. Eliot Prize and the Yakamochi Medal for poetry. In an interview he gave to the Japanese scholar Mitsuko Ono in 2002, he said that he visited Japan in 1991 and he was deeply moved by its art and culture. This Hiberno-Japanese master, so to say, talked about his love for Japanese poetry, Japanese art, in particular Japanese woodcuts, but also Japanese porcelain. And he wrote that, and I quote, "Art, Japanese art, is where there is not a word or a brush stroke too many." And Michael Longley was also is particularly fascinated by how Japanese arts are capable of celebrating the most humble moments of everyday life, turning them into a form of ceremony. And he also praised the Japanese sense of proportion. I have a little anecdote that I would like to include, and then we're going to move on to the next poem. In this interview he gave to Mitsuko Ono, Michael Longley, funnily enough, remembered how during his visit to Japan, his only pair of shoes was stolen while he was visiting the Ryoanji garden, and this caused great embarrassment among the Japanese hosts, of course. And one final thing about the next poem, A Natural History of Armed Conflict. Have I already read it, Giselle? No, perhaps.
Yeah, I can read it again. Maybe people, new other people are coming. So, a madeira do teixo fez a cuia e a flecha, A madeira do teixo fez a cuia e a flecha, e a sombra lateral da cova.
Obrigada. So, the wood of the yew made the bow and the arrow and the graveside shade. So, as you may have noticed, in this 3-line poem, Michael Longley manages to condense this form of art where there is not a brush stroke too many, in 3 lines, forming a haiku. So he really is a Hiberno Japanese master in his way.
Thank you, Irene. Now we move on to Fujifilm. Is it Fujifilm? Filme Fuji, de Karen Carson, de 1998. Temi que o ien começava a cair de novo, desvalorizando meu honorário a ser levado ao lar. Juntei-me à multidão que se aglomerava debaixo da chuva ácida como escolas de peixe num vasto aquário. Alguns se vestiam com ternos de pele de tubarão que brilhavam feito um arco-íris. Outros se vestiam de cirurgiões, com uma máscara branca onde as suas bocas deveriam estar. Outros erguiam sorrisos de barracuda e outros tantos encarnavam peixinhos. Um gordo homem de negócios nadava como um peixe-boi. Eu vi 2 samurais lagosta produzirem as suas próprias espadas de aço zen, infinitamente dobrado a martelo, que brilhava como as geleiras dos fiordes do norte. Eu os flagrei rasgando notas flutuantes de dólares ao meio, debaixo dos luminosos da Coca-Cola, uma roda de roleta neon gigante e os indicadores financeiros pulsando como um cardiógrafo. Obrigada.
Thank you so much, Giselle. I love the musicality of your language.
Thank you. It's very similar to Italian.
I should try and translate it into Italian, but I'll do my best and read it in English, although I'm not a native speaker, of course. So, Fujifilm. I feared the yen was starting to decline again, devaluing my take-home honorarium. I joined the crowd that swarmed beneath the acid rain like schools of fishes in a vast aquarium. Some wore sheepskin suits that shimmered like a rainbow. Some wore surgeons with a white mask where their mouths should be. Some wore barracuda grins and some wore minnow. One fat businessman swam like a manatee. I saw 2 lobster samurai produce their swords of infinitely hammered folded xenosteel that glittered like the icy blue of northern fjords. I snapped them slashing floating dollar bills in half beneath the signs for Coke, the giant neon roulette wheel, the money index pulsing like a cardiograph. So here we move to another poet from Ulster who died in 21, sorry. Kieran Carson was born into an Irish-speaking family, and he worked for 20 years at the Arts Council of Northern Ireland and was later the director of the Seamus Heaney Centre for Poetry at Queen's University. He said that in the 1970s he stumbled on the haiku, and he particularly appreciated Harold G. Henderson's volume entitled An Introduction to Haiku, which became a sort of little Bible to him. Kieran Carson was particularly interested in a search for what he called self-contained images. And this experience that he describes in the poem we just read was based on his 1998 visit to Tokyo, which he described as a psychedelic experience. He visited Tokyo to the invitation of ISEO Japan. And in his own words, the city was, and I quote, ultra-modern on the surface, but go down an alleyway and the old aesthetic is still there. So the collection, which includes this particular poem entitled The 12th of Never, owes much to this experience. And it was published 10 years after another collection entitled Belfast Confetti, where Kieran Carson first included some haiku versions which complete his experimentations with Japan and Japanese forms. Thank you.
Grazie, Irene. Our next poet is Celia Dufresne. She was born in Connemara. Her first book is Scarecrows at Newton Arts, and she's been writing both poetry and theater. She's been with us recently for this same program. I think it was last October, November. Celia Dufresne joined us for the Poesia Meio Dia. And she writes both in Galician and in English, and she self-translates her poems. And the one we read today here is called Light, and it's part of the selection of a few poems that she has written about Japan. She's visited Japan recently also, as invited poet for the University of Kyoto. And I'll read the poem in Portuguese first, in my translation, and then I'll pass on the word to Irene. Luz. A cada vez que ele lançava uma moeda na fenda e girava o telescópio para observar a pradaria, árvores e ruínas, a luz cintilava à distância, mas desaparecia da vista antes que o dinheiro acabasse. Continuou lançando mais e mais moedas, atentando-se aonde a luz havia estado, e a cada vez descobria que se movera, mesmo quando a neblina descera e a cobrira da vista. O vento soprou mais forte atrás de si, o relvado mais fundo sob seus pés, e ainda assim permanecia procurando em seu bolso, gastando cada centavo que tivesse para capturar aquela centelha, mesmo que só por um momento. Quando já esgotado, a lua, encoberta pela nuvem, o relvado no orvalho, cambaleante ia para casa, vindo num rio desembocando no mar, um cardume de lótus, e cada qual com uma vela acesa em seu centro. Conforme a terra se inclinava, o cardume ganhou um impulso, antes do efeito cascata sobre o penhasco. Uma cacofonia de luz vista apenas pelo solitário boêmio, na praia, tocando o seu shamisen. Obrigada.
Obrigada, Giselle. So I'll read the English original. Light. Each time he dropped the coin in the slot and turned the telescope to scan the meadow, trees and ruins, light glimmered in the distance, but disappeared from view before the money ran out. He kept dropping in more coins, focusing on where the light had been, and each time discovered it had moved, even as fog descended and mantled it from view. The wind grew louder at his back, the grass damper beneath his feet, and still he kept searching in his pocket, spending what little he had to capture that spark, if just for a moment. When he was spent, the moon covered in cloud, the grass in dew, he stumbled towards me, coming on a river that cargoed towards the ocean, a shoal of lotuses, each with a lit candle at its core. As the slant sloped, the shoal gained momentum, before cascading over the cliff, a cacophony of light, seen only by the lone vagabond on the beach, strumming his shamisen. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this poem says a lot about Japanese culture and the culture of the pachinko. Right? This is one aspect. But I'll pass on the word back to you for our last reading. Or should I read it in Portuguese first?
Let's go for the Portuguese first and then if it's okay.
Thank you. Então, o nosso próximo poema é do Joseph Woods e se chama Onde a palavra para belo é limpo. O que me fez sair esta manhã foi o barulho de alguém no telhado. Um macaco olhou para baixo, depois se distraiu por algo interessante. Faminto e tendo descido metade da montanha, comia o caroço de uma maçã roubada. Virei-me para ver, a neve havia chegado, e Kyoto, lá abaixo, imersa, rodeada por montanhas que se tornaram brancas da noite ao dia. Por quilômetros, milhões de telhas cobertas e brancas. Obrigada.
Thank you, Giselle. Where the word for beautiful is clean. What brought me out that morning was the sound of someone on the roof. A monkey glanced down, then stared away at the something interesting, eating the core of a stolen apple, hungry and halfway down its mountain. I turned to see snows had arrived, and Kyoto was below in its deep, surrounded by mountains gone white overnight. For miles between, millions of roof tiles, covered and clean. Thank you. Shall I say a few words, or?
Please do, if you can, I'll be honored.
So Joseph Woods was formerly director of Poetry Ireland, and he lived in Japan for 2 years, sharing very fond memories of his experience, in particular of Kyoto and of his linguistic exile, which somehow, in his view, allowed him to, so to say, see Ireland from afar. The collection that includes this poem, entitled Sailing to Hokkaido, was interestingly enough first published in Japanese. And so the poet himself wrote about his experience as a writer and his becoming a writer in Japan. And the word for beautiful that he refers to in Japanese is kirei, which means beautiful, clean, nice, tidy, pretty, fair. So it is in a way as if the whiteness of the snow was a sort of clean slate on which words can acquire a new meaning to him.
Lovely, thank you. And we move on to our final video, but just before that, I remind all the listeners, eu quero lembrar a todos os que nos assistem que a nossa próxima sessão será na última quarta-feira de junho, com a Susan Roy de volta. E ficamos agora com mais um poema do Joseph Woods no vídeo que a Juliana generosamente, que gentilmente nos disponibiliza. Obrigada.
Velejando a Hokkaido. Após o jantar, ando solitário até a popa e observo o tempo que leva discernir entre uma escuridão e outra. O horizonte era a fronteira em que céu e mar se encontraram. Por dois horizontes, céu e mar, céu e terra, duas palavras dançam. Uma escuridão inunda a outra esta noite. Nada as separa. Retorno à batida palpável do coração que as gerou. Poema de Joseph Woods, Sailing to Hokkaido, na minha tradução. Obrigada.